and he compiles a lot of images from people that were affected by the earthquake in Manabí. So I'm going to share the song with you. On the bottom part of the screen that you have the link there, you can find the lyrics there, both in Spanish and in English, so that you can follow the song.
Sí se oye la canción, ¿no es cierto?
You can hear the song, right?
Un poco bajito.
A bit low, though.
Lo tengo a tope. Bueno, le pongo play. De todas formas lo pueden oír en la
Well, anyway, you can hear it on the platform if you prefer as well.
Quiero contar una cosa loca, una cosa buena, que vine aprendiendo desde mi tierra, que es bien pequeña y de gente linda y de gente buena, con alma de gente linda y de gente buena, con alma de guerra. Decía mi abuelo, ser buena gente es un buen negocio. Decía mi abuelo, ser buena gente es un buen negocio. Para ir subiendo se da la mano, no se pisa al otro. Para ir subiendo se da la mano, no se pisa al otro. La, 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 hay días que soy una nube negra sobre tu espalda. No quiero alejarte, quiero cuidarte. Y si hace falta llevarte muy lejos, lejos de tú, y encontrar la calma. Llevarte muy lejos, lejos de tú, y encontrar la calma. La, 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 la. La, la, la. Ay, déjame darte todo lo que tengo, el mar y el cielo. Y en tiempos de lluvia decirte lento cuánto te quiero. Crece conmigo, no crezcas solo. Vamos más lejos. Crece conmigo, no crezcas solo. Vamos más lejos. La, 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 la. La, 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 la. Y déjame darle todo lo que tengo, el mar y el cielo. Y en tiempos de lluvia decirte lento cuánto te quiero. Crece conmigo, no crezcas solo. Vamos más lejos. Crece conmigo, no crezcas solo. Vamos más lejos. La, 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 la. La, 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 la. La, 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 la. La, 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 la. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Cari.
Thank you, Scotty. Well, welcome. As we said, we chose that song because it's made from an Ecuadorian artist that wrote it based on the earthquake that happened in Ecuador in 2016, specifically in Manabi. And besides that, we chose a couple of readings for you and also a video. I don't know if you had the opportunity to see it. It's a TEDx talk from Chimamanda Adichie, and we chose it because it talks a lot about telling the history, about who tells the stories and how important it is that through those speeches, what stories are invisibilized and which are actually visible, and how that happens. So she talks a lot about the impact that she had and on her personal journey to identity, the fact that there are a lot of histories that we simply don't hear. I want to talk a little bit about that video. I don't know if you had the opportunity to see it and or about the song that we just heard. Yeah, maybe just to complement what Kari said on the session, on today's session, we're going to talk about how to involve different audiences through samples and web pages and the different ways to interact with one another. So we can discuss based on that topic. That's the global topic of today. What you guys read or saw. Cassandra? I think that the lyrics of the song are a very good example to kind of integrate many of the elements that Malena presented last week of how history is told. Because it's a song that's written in the first person. It has quotes, from testimonies of what the grandfather said. So it's an example of how history can also be reflected in different types of means, right? And how it can also be a part of the memory construction process. Thank you, Sandra. There's always this connection between memory and art that we can also see here. Yes. Someone else that wants to say something about the song or about the readings? Oh, I wanted to say that one of the readings that we sent was called "What Do Images Want?" Despite the fact that it doesn't talk precisely about web pages or stuff like that, we thought it was interesting because it talks about a change in paradigm. I mean, we cannot think images and reading, apart from one another, such as mind and body. Now we are going through a deconstruction process, and from ideas that modernity imposed on us and that don't adjust to what we are living right now. So now an image already proposes meanings as well as a text proposes images. And we are constantly living in a mixed environment. It's impossible to separate both means, right? So that's why we are continuously working in an interdisciplinary way by mixing possibilities so that we can represent what we think. So I think it's a text that starts working on the idea of an image and text. It doesn't talk about image or text, separately. So I think it's the basis so that we can later on conceptualize different things. Thank you, Cassandra. Elisa, do you have a comment? Yes. Hello with everyone. Good morning. I like the video a lot and also the other materials that you sent us. And from the video, what I'd like to highlight is that there's no single story. I think that's very important because I like this phrase that history is told by those who win, so to say. So we forget a lot of times we forget that there's a lot of other stories and a lot of other experiences of how an event was lived or how it was experienced. A story, a process. So I like that there's not a single story, right? Also, that history has the power to give back to people. So thinking about the neighborhoods in and of themselves, yeah, I mean they go through very strong processes. They have a very firm origin, and the idea is that they can self-recognize, themselves, and that they can have value from history. And I think that precisely history can be a very powerful tool for that. Thank you, Elisa. That's very powerful. I think that just kind of goes hand in hand with what I have to do. That's the summary of last week's session. Thank you for that. Eva?
Tienes el micrófono
Eva,
apagado.
I think your microphone's on mute. Yeah, I self-muted myself. Well, thank you everyone for the material. They are actually very good. And just a short comment on the TED Talk that I thought was very interesting. And it's the impact of the stories we tell on children, and how from a very young age they can experience a very hard impact. And I think that's something that we need to keep in consideration. How something so simple, in quotation marks, that we do, like a story that our grandmother tells us, or maybe a story that they read to us every night, how that can have such a big influence that it even determines ourselves and the way that we look at ourselves. So I think that that was something that's that happens every day, and something that we all live from a very young age. And I think that's something very big, so that we can think about the ways that we communicate with one another, and thinking about children and boys and girls as the future generations. I think that's something that's very important to think about. Thank you. Thank you, Eva. Yes, that makes us think about those audiences as well, that they are in our minds in the project, but it's always hard to address. So kind of to use time properly.
Something from last session. Last session was about memory and histories for risk analysis and also risk management. And Malena and Ari, they presented very interesting talks on memory, on how memory is built, and how communities can empower themselves by telling some stories from that give them agency, but also how those experiences like community museums can be sometimes very vulnerable, especially in these moments that we're living. Ari, she made us reflect on the different aspects of history for history's sake, but also history that has a deep understanding of processes and structures. And so she discussed this idea of how we can do some analysis of recent past, but also complemented with deep history and understanding those root causes more as a structural influence on risk. And I think the exercise that Malena proposed also help us have this dimension of what is public, what is in the streets, what is history in the streets, but how history also influences our individuality from our family histories and our local histories. So if anyone wants to say something or comment something that was left from the last session, now is the time. Well, I think everybody's ready to listen to Jenny. So Jenny is going to talk us a bit about her experience and how to communicate risk. So go ahead, Jenny. You can share your screen. I don't know if you're talking, but we can't hear you in case you're talking. I think your mic.
Yeah, there we go. Great. There we go. I got it. My finger is not delicate enough. So I guess this is something, it's a nice opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done on risk communication in the past, very much focused on volcanic areas, which obviously Quito is partly. And what I thought it might be interesting to do is to reflect a little bit on some of the learning that we've done, because I think all these issues that you've been talking about here, with thinking about many different voices, trying to reach the most vulnerable, and then also thinking about how the challenge that we have with this really wonderful opportunity with the website to try and also make sure that what we're doing is reaching the people who we really want to reach in this project through the website. So this is kind of my adventure, which started out with a really big research project called Striva, which mainly what I'll do is talk about the results from there. You've heard me talking about the things that we've done subsequently, which was really to bring the humanities into bear into developing exhibitions. And then this week, the website, because this week is the 25th anniversary of the start of the eruption of the Super Hills volcano in Montserrat. So we've just launched a website this week to do with this. And the big lesson I want to give to you is, of course, that risk communication is complex, but I think we're starting to have a really clear idea of what we want to do with that risk communication. And if we do that, we can really learn about what works, about what we will, about what we're going to do. And when we learn that, that's going to be such valuable information for future projects, and also really understanding how it goes to kind of making risk action. So for the first thing, I just wanted, for those of you who are not so familiar with hazard or risk communication, there's actually different types of ways in which we will think about that. There's giving out emergency warnings, and really what you need to do in that instance is you want an immediate response. It's during a crisis, and you want people to conform or do what you wish to do with those messages. Then, of course, there's a sort of longer term prospect, which is thinking about information provision and education, and really kind of thinking about long-term preparedness and mitigation, the communication of hazard maps, risk maps, making sure people know where to go and what to do. And that's really kind of focused a bit more on preparedness and then also recovery. But this third thing is really very much what this project is about, is kind of doing both of these embedded within partnership and dialogue. And the idea that kind of working together with the communities helps us build a mutual consensus, and also create, in what is a very complex landscape, shared meanings. And actually that dimension of communication is really, really important. So I guess my experience is that thinking through the communication and what you're doing is an absolute essential element to success of any risk-orientated project, whether it's like ours and quite as interdisciplinary as not. And at the heart of this was a research summary paper that was done of 30 years worth of risk communication efforts. And this is one of their kind of key conclusions, which is just that information moving into a vacuum is never actually going to be particularly successful. And there's very little sense that people are not doing things because they don't understand them, or it's not explained clearly enough. There's all sorts of other things going on. And that's partly why we have woven this complex web that we have in terms of how we've set this project up, is because this has been understood for a long time, and we are trying to kind of find ways to do better than that. So the interdisciplinary approaches are absolutely essential. And I guess what I thought I'd do is talk about some of the ways that we've broken that down to try and do something tangible and then measured success that maybe has some bearing on what you're thinking about, both with the construction of the website and thinking through how to integrate the history into the broader process. So what improves responses? So there's two sort of basic ways: top down, which is where the authorities give directions, no discussion, just people do what they're told, and then a sort of bottom up, where we work with the community to build capacity, self, collective reliance and determination. And really that's the approach that we are mainly thinking about doing in this process. But I think it's worthwhile thinking that there's crossovers of information between this, and actually it's not necessarily always appropriate. And one of the things I would say in all of the research that I've done is, of course, the trust is the most important dimension. People will respond in a very reactive way if they trust the person who's giving the information, if they've taken a previously kind of all-encompassing approach. So that's the real kind of challenge in terms of thinking through the different ways. And one of the things that often gets left behind a little bit is thinking about this analysis of communication. So I've got a little exercise for you to do to think about this. We do take quite an instinctive approach. That worked, they liked it, oh, this is good. But what we want to do actually is break that down and understand what is it that worked about this? Why do people respond well to this? And this is just a little example from a very famous book by a Nobel Prize winning economist, believe it or not, called Daniel Kahneman. And it's about the different ways in which we react and think to things. So I guess the question I have here is, are the two towers the same height? And then the second question is, would the horizontal blocks be the same height if placed vertically? And hopefully what you were doing when you were answering the first question, you just kind of looked across and instinctively said, yeah, they're the same height. Whereas with the blocks that I placed in a slightly harder place, they're sitting down horizontally, you had to start counting the blocks and making a guess that those blocks were the same size. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that with some of these communication processes, if we set this up well and think about how we value that evidence, we're going to be so much stronger in terms of thinking about how to do it. So the approach that we've always taken is kind of testing ideas and attitudes to volcanic risk, and effectively what we're trying to do is defy this statement made 40 years ago by Bauman or 30 years ago by Sims and Bauman. It's always a very much mixed methodology, and the thing I want to really emphasize, particularly those of you who are here from the physical sciences, is one of the things that I think is absolutely key to the success of this risk communication is that it's placed within the physical framework of our understanding of the anticipated or actual phenomena. We have to understand how and where the hazards are happening in order to do this well. So we can't abandon the physical sciences, they have to kind of cuddle or embrace the whole of the process. So this is just a little example from a very long time ago from Montserrat about just how taking a systematic approach can really enrich understanding. And this is something that we all understand instinctively, which is that topographic information is very difficult to understand. And so this is a map of the hazard zones here of Montserrat. And you can see here, this is where the flows have gone. This is the safe zone. This is not the safe zone. And it's a traditional topographic map. And this is what they were using to communicate. And there was a lot of unrest and not very great pleasure about the drawing of these boundary lines. They were entirely related to the physical properties of the flows and where we thought they would go, but people didn't understand and thought they were very arbitrary. So what we did is we tested different ways of looking at the hazard. So this is a three-dimensional GIS. That it was a super sophisticated GIS for the time, Scott, so you have to forgive me for its colouring in. It's not as good as yours, but it's a very long time ago we did this, and with the things draped over the topography, and then of course aerial photographs. And this is one of my favourite pieces of research that I've ever done, so forgive me if I've shown it to you before. This was with my PhD student at the time. These are people locating themselves in these different places, which are valleys and hills, which are of course incredibly important for the topography. So that's where the questions we were asking were physically situated. This is how people did with that topographic map when we asked them where these places were. So the symbols represent where people showed us on the map. We said, show us where these places are. This is what it looked like with the conventional map. This is what it looks like as soon as we presented them with a more three-dimensional image there. So you can see the symbols are all jumping together. That is the Belém Valley. That is St. George's Hill. This is the Tar River, and this area is a slightly smaller hill here. So people could much more easily, and people actually said to us as we were doing this, oh, I see, the line is there because this is very dangerous, when they could get that perspective and the relationship between the topography. So if you do this kind of work, then one of the things that you realize is that actually you learn things that are useful for all the different types of communication processes. So just very quickly, this is some of the stuff that we did with Streba. I've picked out a couple of things just because I think they're the most relevant to some of the thinking around the website and evidence gathering around there. This was the large project. Of course, we were working with IG during Streba, working around Tungurawa as well. Loads of people in the project. And really what we were thinking about, again, is that really challenge that we have with multi-hazards in this instance, the dynamism of the risk, the things that change in the landscape, the things that change politically, and then the things that the volcano changes by erupting, and how do you actually deal with that. So the themes that came out of Streba, I'm not going to dwell on this for too long. You can read it here on the board. But one of the things that this is where some of the emerging themes that we had are very similar to what we're trying to grapple with here, which is where we have important people who help create change, but also we have to cope with scientific uncertainty, and that people's actual, even in an emergency, people's behaviour will be governed by what's going on in their broader lives. And this is something that we've talked about a lot in the project already. And then all of that means that the communication is a really, really important trust. And this is where there's a direct relationship with some of the things that we're talking about with the public history. So one of the things that we decided, there's a lot of evidence, there's a strong linkage between social memory and preparedness. But with the problem that active volcanoes, in this instance, the social memory is shorter than the length of time between eruptions, particularly in the Caribbean. And there's a huge range of different factors that cause the preservation and the memory. And then I think the point that Elisa was making earlier is really true here, that the social memory becomes a little cloudy. It's not necessarily remembering the true events. And it's that where that genuine partnership between the scientific knowledge and the local knowledge is actually really important in thinking about all the different stories. And it may be that some of the things that people remember and that are transmitted through social memory are not actually that helpful in terms of kind of encompassing preparedness. So one of the first places we worked here was St. Vincent. And so some of the general things, which I think are really important in thinking about the construction of the website, are also true. Uncertainty and thinking about the 3D subsurface. This is something that Alfredo has said is very interesting and useful. It's certainly something we found before. The coupling between hazards and morphology, really thinking through that spatial awareness, and that the sources of information need to be trusted. And then what our kind of social aspect of the research project did is it gave us some very useful and specific information with St. Vincent. And in the instance, we didn't use it to construct a website in this instance. What we did is we decided to make some films, and I thought it might be useful sharing a little bit about that. So the idea of these films were actually to try and have community engagement. So I thought there's some parallel with the website idea where what we're using is something that's actually at one remove to actually try and enhance engagement with fairly vulnerable communities who don't have that much access to the kinds of materials and things, amenities that we would do anyway. But we thought that the process of creating the films would actually create a process of engagement. So that's something where I thought there might be some helpful analogies. And really what we wanted to do is motivate people at risk to take action. So one of the problems in the Caribbean is that people expect that somebody will come and help them out. And that actually one of the most useful things that they can do is actually take action with the resources that they have. So it was something that would kind of empower them to think about doing that. Very strong cultural memory, not a social memory, of a very big eruption that caused devastation. You can see this is the top part of the island. It's a small island. And then more recent memory, which remains a social memory because people is within living memory. So what we did is we created films, and the purpose of those films were really to kind of try and empower people and think about what it was. And instead of having devastation and people dying in pyroclastic flows and exciting images of the eruption, we decided just to have people from a multitude of different perspectives telling their story, with that story edited and rooted in the hazard messaging around what we knew how the volcano behaved. So it's done extremely well. And the thing I wanted to share with you is the blue points here are actually people on St. Vincent. It's a very small island. It's only got a population of 100,000. We think probably 80% of the population has watched this video. But what's really good for us with the video is you can see people are coming back to it every year on the anniversary of the eruption, which means that some of the processes that we went through were successful. How am I doing for time? Too long? Okay, Carrie?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll keep going. So one of the things that we realized obviously with this is how to take the sort of one remove film and think really about the touring, about how to kind of reach the most vulnerable communities. So that's where sharing the historical data actually became extremely powerful. People were very interested in that history. And what we did is we actually did something similar to what we're proposing in the hub, which is looking at scenarios and actually taking the films to the people. So that's maybe something to think about in terms of that hybrid model that we're going to have in COVID times. And we went all around the island to different places in the red zone. This is the red zone of the volcano here, and had a series of kind of showcases where we brought the materials that were remote digital materials and showed them in the different communities. And the thing I just want to show you here is the percentage of people who've never attended volcano information meetings. They generally have these meetings all the time. There's some communities where people are too busy or too taken up with doing other things, but the novelty of what we were doing and the interest in what we were doing with the films and the scenarios and the exhibits about the historical information meant that a lot of people came who'd never been to these sorts of informations before. So this is just a couple of pictures of people in the local schools watching the screening of the video. And then we took the opportunity to talk to them about some of the materials that we had and talk to them about the eruption, and carefully recorded some of these responses. I'm not going to read these two out to you. The key point from these, I guess, is that one of the things that happened is there was the change in attitude towards how to take response, who was responsible. They formed community neighbourhoods and watches, and you can see here people making a mental model connection between what's going on with the film. So the fact that we didn't show any footage of things erupting. What we did show was footage of people talking about it, talking about how it felt, and it had quite a strong impact on them. And then obviously people were also able...
Jenny, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. People were also able to say things about what actions they might take. So it's kind of moving from knowing about something to taking that knowledge. And so we were able, even though we'd chosen quite a remote product, to do something with the follow-on process that allowed that to go. And then just to finish off, we showed these films in Colombia, and they loved it so much they then requested that we make the same thing, and we went through the same process in Colombia. And it's a shame Jerry's not here, because I think this is an impersonation of Jerry. They actually responded to our films by creating, some local actors created a play. So this is us. I think the gringos coming to visit in Colombia with our luggage to talk about volcanic eruptions. So they created plays to talk about what was really quite a traumatic eruption in Nevada del Ruiz, but again, without any actual footage of the play. So we had great turnout in Colombia, and again, we're able to use that to understand more about the audiences. And I guess it's that kind of circle of knowledge, thinking what are we trying to achieve here? How do we know if we've achieved it? And then using the process actually to learn even more. And I would say that's what's very enriching about that. So risk communication and science communication has to be in a project list about so much more than just education and understanding. But making people part of the product and the process is incredibly important. And I think that's an interesting challenge for us in thinking through what we're going to do. And sharing those experiences, so doing that together strengthens relationships, but also from my perspective, again, in terms of thinking about people's social vulnerability, has really strengthened that. People really like to see and hear from people they relate to. That's very much, you must all click on Mountain of Glow, the absolute thing. You will not see many pictures of scientists on that website. It's all about the people who experienced the eruption. And then something that makes me so excited about what you're planning to do is making it beautiful. Aesthetics were extremely, extremely important in terms of people's engagement. That was something I wasn't expecting. And then, of course, the fact that we really wanted to reach and understand people from different social classes, and taking the time was invaluable to go and actually take that material into the communities. And I know that's what you've all got plans for as well. That's it.
Thank you, Jenny. Okay, so now Karina and Paula and Cassandra will take the floor.
Ok, yo voy a hablar en castellano.
Pues bien, I'm going to talk in Spanish, and well, you can follow my lead. One of the things that I'd like to talk about and is precisely these recommendations that Jenny makes about how to understand and try to relate and put ourselves in the shoes of the other people and talk their same language, right? I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see this. Okay. You guys have the link if you want to review the webpage, afterwards. You can look at now or after the presentation. That's doesn't really matter. So one of the most important things in the research process is what does all this research do? Why is it important? One of that is, of course, being able to deliver the knowledge to people that are involved in a way, that are interested, or that can somehow change their lives. But mainly, communication doesn't just mean delivering information, but generating a response. I mean, the process isn't over until those who receive that information can generate something, as well. That can be an immediate reaction, that can be an emotional response, an information response, meaning give the researchers more information that they can work on, or it can also be including that information in their lives, and that it can somehow change the social or political dynamics that exist in the environment we are working in. In that sense, there's a sort of a communication circle, and when we start thinking about how to deliver the information to different public, there's different steps, right? So the first one is to find a way to create interest. That means, be heard. Both, I mean, that there has to be this interest, both from the message and from the speaker. That interest can exist already, or we can awaken it in a way. Afterwards, through the research, of course, we've done some research to know precisely what is it that we're going to say, but it also implies a research from who's the public, how are we talking to them, and how they understand the ideas, the language, and so on. I'm going to focus on the visual language precisely because I'm a visual communicator, but that can translate to different platforms and different ways of communication. Next is to organize the information we have in an already codified way. In the sense that we just talked, I mean, how our public understands information. And based on that, construct a speech. I mean, to know what is it that we're going to do, what is it that we're going to say. And within this construction comes what are the means that we're going to use and what context this is going to play out in. This is pretty much basic theory about communication up to this point, but it gets a bit more complicated when our public doesn't have a single profile. When we have to work with several profiles and several ways to organize that information or to generate those speeches. Afterwards, we have speech reception, and that has to do with how people perceive the images, the text, the sounds that we are using. And from that point, the people that are transmitting our messages kind of release that information by using a soccer metaphor. The ball is in the court of whoever receives it. So reception means how people receive it, but it's not just that. It's also like being able to adopt that information and being able to transmit it through their own means and yeah, make it their own. Afterwards they have to incorporate what they learned. It doesn't just mean to know it and make it a part of their intellectual process, but make it part of their lives, for them to become a habit or change a system, if we're talking about institutional processes or processes that are linked to public institutions or large institutions in and of themselves. As we can see, there's a lot of steps within that process, and the key lies on we are going to how we're going to get to the point where that apprehension and learning is actually successful. We have understood that the way we learn has to do not only with an intellectual process. I mean, it's not only in our heads, and it doesn't just mean understanding the language, for instance, that they're talking in, but also understand that our entire body, I mean, the most basic and primitive way in which we connect with the world is through our five senses, that they react in any way to that information. I mean, teaching it through different stimulus and creating more complex experiences. This, I mean, that when we understand a message and we associate it with a smell, a taste, a texture, a temperature, for instance, that we are experiencing at the time, or weight, visuals, of course. Every person has a different way of learning and they trust more or less in different senses. So this means that the more senses we can use in different levels, it's easier to generate, a reception and apprehension of the message we are transmitting. So when this process comes into play, the first thing we have to do is to expose ourselves to a stimulus. As I mean, to you have to stimulate any of these senses to create an experience. Afterwards, we have to react to stimulus, right? So once we have felt that stimulus, how we're going to react to it? How is our body going to react? This can be linked both to the physical or to the psychological part. If it's physical, it means that our pupils are going to dilate, our body is going to behave in a certain way. I mean, how blood runs through our body, for example, there's very interesting studies that talk about how different colors open blood vessels or close them, or pores. Same thing happens with smells or textures and temperature, etc. And afterwards, the psychological part of the reaction to that stimulus has to do with our memories and to the relations we make to other knowledges we already have. Next, we have the process that we are normally used to learning. That's kind of this more intellectual part, and it's rationalizing the stimulus, creating a link, an intellectual link, and how that stimulus is related to something that they are saying to me. And finally, to remember that reaction. I mean, when we remember something, anything, any of these steps, whether it is the physical stimulus or the intellectual information, that we can go back to that experience, and find that physical reaction that we had, from our body, and afterwards the physical will transform into emotional, and associate that stimulus and that knowledge to something that you experience. Therefore, the reaction is the most important part. Once we have manage to create a reaction, both positive and negative, we can be almost absolutely sure that there's going to be a memory created. For that, and to understand how we are going to understand reactions and stimuli, we have what what we're talking about, how our audiences can be separated and how they understand things, both biologically and psychologically. Like we said, biologically has to do with our age, our gendered, kind of the demographic aspects and the social group that we belong to, and cannot be changed, basically. And the stimuli in this area have to do with how our body reacts to that. That is, of course, related to this type of elements, right? And afterwards, the psychological part has to do with our consumer habits, behaviors, tastes, interests, that in many ways is linked to the social context and space the way live it. And we have to consider all these things when we are creating a message and getting that to a message. I'm going to leave the floor to Cassandra. That she's going to talk about how all that we have been talking about can be applied in the digital world. Cassandra, if you want to, please. Yes, thank you. So I think that's something that's very important to connect this aspect about the analysis that Karina is talking about is thinking about who is on the internet. So you can go down a little bit. So currently in Ecuador, we have a very large quantity of users that use um, computers, desk computers, or laptops. Despite that, the use of smartphones isn't as high as we would think, because we tend to think that everyone is like we are, and so tablets is just a minimum amount. This data is very important so that we can understand how the platform has to be designed. In this case, we would have to emphasize on a platform that looks good and that works on a desk computer, but also thinking on the access that people have to internet, in Ecuador. Thinking that municipal schools do have computers and they also have internet. So that way we are able to guarantee that young communities and people in general can access information. I think Jenny emphasized that a lot. The fact that how are we going to spread this information? How we're going to make it reach the people? So if we cannot guarantee people have a way to access the web page, then it doesn't really have any sense in doing it. So this data I obtained from an organization that creates free access data for any researcher, and I think they are basic, to understand. Yes, in that sense, we thought it was interesting to tell you how internet started. It all starts 4 years before the atomic bomb, from an American from a small town in the U.S. That's the director of the Manhattan Project. In the year 1941, he is dedicated to create two atomic bombs. They launch it. The Americans win the Second World War, and they think, no, no, well, the physicists don't have to do bombs, anymore. So what are we gonna do now? And he writes a very important text for the history of the internet, is as we may think. And part of the central part, that says that throughout the centuries we have lost a lot of knowledge, scientific knowledge, because we haven't been able to share this knowledge, and we don't know how to communicate it. So based on this text, he just invents and says, we could create this computer, kind of this machine. It's he just thinks about that machine. Vannevar Bush thinks that in 1945, and he says we could create a machine that allows us to have links, you know, to text that can actually take us to new ideas. So he kind of just imagined Wikipedia, you know, like we know it now. You know, you have Wikipedia, there's a link there, you click on it and it takes you to a different page. And it's kind of just thinking about the associative nature of the human brain. I mean, Van der Bush says that the human brain has different paths. So one path takes you to another one, and it's like a big forest. So you know, if they read a poem to you, and then they play a video for you, and they read out live something for you, and then you hear something, the brain can connect that instantly. So we learn better that way. Based on that, and based on that machine that never existed, Ted Nelson, an American, creates the concept of hypertext. You know, hyper has to do with a mathematical term that says we can go in any direction. You know, we can obtain knowledge from all directions. And text, and if you can go a bit up, Cari, and text has to do with this. You know, this is a beautiful work from Mark Lombardi that he made this textual and graphic connections. You know, from how we think. You know, in the analog and the digital, because we know that the digital doesn't really solve everything. We also need the analog, and we need to work on that part. And the text has this origin, you know, that has to do with links. I mean, means how are we linking the information, you know, to share it afterwards? So, I mean, in that sense, we asked ourselves, who's interacting, right? In Ecuador, 76% of internet users are between 16 and 24 years of age. I think that's just an amazing data, you know, because it, it makes us think on high school students and university students, and thinking that the platform that we have to create needs to be a link to the educational programs of the state. We need that teachers use this platform in their classrooms, that for children to get familiarized with it, that it can be legitimized as well, you know, so that it carries this kind of serious tone and used as an educational tool. And I also think it's important. What do you think are the two words that are most looked up in Ecuador? You know, on February of 2020. I mean, well, the second word is translation. I mean, people are, you know, focused in English. They want to know how you say this and that. They want to understand what's showing up in the internet, because a lot of the information that's on the internet, it's in English, right? They want to understand that. So I think it's key to have the platform both in English and Spanish, you know, crossing mixed knowledge in different languages. But the first word is Facebook, our, you know, great enemy that we're going to transform into our ally. Because if you can't fight it, join it. We need to use social networks for this page to work. We need to create content, you know, friendly content in the format that young generations are using, in the reading logics that they are using. We need to adapt and trying to transform our knowledge to those logics, right? And in that sense, we are thinking that this page needs to be an interactive documentary, right? We're going to have a lot of video, a lot of audio, a lot of graphics, a lot of infographics, and we are thinking it from a text of Cortés y Pérez that talks about the transformative capacity that an interactive documentary have, and the you know, of transforming a passive actor into a political actor. And that's how we thought this is the way of to go into the classrooms. How can we include teaching elements so that can allow me or the guide or the professor to kind of use this platform, you know, from what Jenny just talked. How do we use to explain these very complex maps of volcanoes, for instance, or from Cotopaxi, for instance? How do we explain this, these points and circles and triangles, how do we explain them in a fun way so that people can understand, what are their dangers and their hazards, and more importantly, from a political perspective, how do we do for them to take action? And I think that's the main challenge of this page.
Estamos un poco justos de tiempo.
I think we're running short on time.
Ya con esto ya terminamos, chicos.
This is the last part. Yeah, yeah, this is it. This is it. Yeah.
Entonces,
Great. So
cómo hacemos con el tema del tiempo, si quieren hacer
I don't know how we can do with time. Do you want to take a short break, or you can just go, for a small Q&A session? You can raise your hands, I guess, if you want a little break, or if we can have a small Q&A session, about presentations, any questions, comments you may have, and we can continue afterwards, just straight on.
Yo creo que hagamos.
A ver, Pancho.
Hola, buenos días a todos. Yo tengo una
Pancho,
pregunta.
I have a question.
Cuando vamos del geofísico normalmente
When we go to the, from as a geophysicist, to talk about volcanic phenomena, we face very mixed groups, right? Both in age, gender, even in knowledge. I mean, there's people that, for instance, can even read or write, and it's very, very hard to try to generate this reaction in people, right? With a topic that's complex in a way, or that we as volcanologists make complex. So my question is, do you have any suggestion so that we can try and improve that? Because it's very complicated. I mean, I try my best to try and reach everyone, but it's very hard. I mean, do you think it's better to work with different groups? I mean, have the older people in a group, the younger people in another group, or maybe divide them between men and women? Or, I mean, do you have any suggestions for us to actually reach those people? Okay, I'm gonna go first. Do you mind if we listen to different questions first? So someone else that has a comment or a question. Thank you very much, Pancho. I think that's the challenge, that we all have, how we face that. So until anyone else, I wanted to ask something to Jenny.
The most difficult is from information to pass into action. And so from your experience, how do you, before it happens, how do you know if something has been effective to produce action, or do you have to wait until something happens to see if there's action there? Ok, a ver, Marco y Giuseppe, y después les dejamos contestar.
Marco and Giuseppe now, and then you can reply.
Sí, gracias, Karina, Cassandra.
Well, thank you, Karina, Cassandra, Paul, Jenny, for the discussions. These are very interesting, presentations, and thank you, Elisa, as well, because all the conferences, I think, have been thought in a comprehensive way, to kind of construct a larger debate. And I have thought about certain things about the interdisciplinary exercise that we're trying to construct in the hub. They're kind of just, general reflections from what I heard last week and this week as well, and from what we heard in the last conference cycle, right? So it's kind of understanding the logic of the constructivist epistemologies that we are developing now, and everything that they have meant for social sciences in the last decades. The so-called post-structuralism that kind of has constructed around approaches such as the geolinguistical, the post-colonialism, or communicative action, and the liberation idea of Habermas. So that has kind of transformed social sciences, and that's where I want to make the connections, in two senses. On the one hand, show new ways to produce knowledge. That I think that's something that we have discussed a lot, and we can do both from communication and from history. and that's a very important rupture in it of itself. Talking about the interdisciplinarity, because that's where we come into conflict, in a good sense, though, with other sciences, with other epistemologies. And second rupture, that's the questioning the object study, such as the hazard, just to name one, that's constructed from the physical sciences and from the political science or from economics, from a rationality, so to say, or from a rational background, that's questioned. I mean, the meanings of the process itself from public history, such as Malena told us last week, and from the image, like we are seeing now. So it has been very helpful. Many of the discussions that we have from semiotics, particularly, I think that's the debate that's behind the discussion that we're having today, but also from the communication studies that are very strong, and that kind of have articulated with the social sciences and with the political sciences, with sociology in general, and from the cultural studies in general, that I think are going to help us have this interdisciplinarity. I think it's a very interesting debate. I don't know if Alfredo is here, but he was talking about urban imaginaries. I mean, how the synthesis kind of leads us to understand these two ruptures, right? On the one hand, the new ways of producing knowledge from the community itself, such as is our case, and from questioning the object studies beyond their supposed rationality. So I think that's interesting, and I kind of just want to, set it up there as a perspective, the broader exercise that we are trying to generate. I think that's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Marco, for the summary and that is the broader discussion you're presenting. Giuseppe?
Hello, thank you, Elisa, and thank you to all for your presentations. I will talk in English, it's better for your ears. Just a couple of comments about strategy of communication. Because as you were showing, as I think Karina was showing before, we have different targets. So we might have older people, we might have teenagers. So to rightly communicate to the right people, we really need to have an integrated strategy. And it requires a lot of work because probably you will need to adapt your kind of language to different kind of audiences. However, the question might be, are we assuming that, how to say, do we really need to find a specific strategy for a specific group of people, or we are assuming that the kind of language we use is not adequate for a teenager or old people? So I just want to make a little bit complex this idea of reflecting on the kind of target and on the kind of people we are talking to. However, we also think to the community in terms of how can I say, in terms of a normal kind of language we might use. But for example, we might reflect on the fact that there might be people who is blind within the community. So we might need, for example, a website or a text that uses also an alphabet for blind people or deaf people. So we might use another kind of language. So I think that there are a lot of issues within communication that we do not always consider because, there are really some minorities, let's say, some non-conformal minorities that we are not able to reach. And I think we should reflect on this and think, for example, particularly in Europe, we might have people who do not speak the national language. So how, for example, to include migrants or to include people who do not have access to main communication forms such as TV or smartphone. So I think it's quite complicated, but yeah, I think there is a lot of work to be done, but also to reflect a little bit on which is the kind of people that we really want to reach. Thank you.
Thanks, Giuseppe. Jenny has to go to commemorate the Sophia eruption. So let's her answer the questions, and Cassandra, and then we'll try to ask the questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly answer some of them. It's really interesting to hear Marco's comments as well. So in answer to your question, Elisa, I think one of the things that we're trying to do with this is not just have an emergency response, but create a community that is prepared in an integrated way. So I think some of the ways we can measure success is seeing actions, small actions that are taken that create that more integrated preparedness. And that's certainly how we've thought about that. So for example, neighborhood community watches, or things where people make small adaptations, dig out their drains because they know it's going to flood worse. That sort of thing are actions that we can measure even without having the hazard have to happen. And then to answer Giuseppe's point really quickly, I'm sure the others will talk about it then. I think one of the things we really want to do is to engender collectivity. So that's always been some of the views in some of the communities where we work. So kind of that demographic aggregation of people is maybe not, and certainly in terms of looking at the community, is actually thinking about working together and how you kind of bring the different groups together. And I don't mean that doesn't mean you haven't got to have separated strategies, but I think an ultimate goal with some of these things is really creating collectivity, even collectivity with hated members of the city council, if you like. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jenny. Cassandra.
Sí, bueno, a mí me gustaría conectar varias.
Well, I would like to mention a couple of things. Thinking on what Marco mentioned about the learnings from the constructivism and from what Giuseppe establishes, that maybe having specific audiences, and also responding to Francisco's question if we should separate these groups when we go and present the ideas. I think we could learn a lot from local experiences and from rural education, where what takes place in a classroom is that a professor has a class with 40 kids from different ages, from with different skills, and what they do is they leave paternalism, aside. I mean, it's not the professor that teaches everything, but the older people teach the younger ones. So I think that by using the internet, we can create an experience that is not individual, but to be collective. So it's not just this intimate, private thing, but for those people that can actually access the platform, for them to feel as bridges, so that they can create links with their surroundings. I think it can be a very interesting dynamic to have these vehicles and maybe create, a young, fresh, colloquial speech, so that the scientific can reach through the community, through that. I mean, we don't want to eliminate any type of demographic, within the communities. We want to include learning material, teaching material, so that professors and teachers can use them within the classroom, so that they can link them with the specific elements that they are teaching. But I think that if we learn from the local, we can take a lot of advantages for this platform. Thank you, Cassandra. We have run a bit longer. I don't know if Marisa or Cassandra have, some short comments, or we can just go straight to the exercise. I just wanted to ask where you got the information about the 75% of people use internet. I mean, just what's the source? Because I read an article and I thought that the people that used cell phones, was actually a larger number. So I was a bit confused, and I just want to compare to what I had in mind. Cassandra just shared it on the on the chat, so you can see it. Of course, I mean, there's going to be controversy in the data. It's impossible to have a perfect clarity. I used this data set because they're, they're meant for researchers to use. They're not meant for commercial purposes. But we can contrast different data, of course. Or if you want to complement something, and then we can just say, Eva, to close. Yes, we're thinking about the different learning resources within the web page. I mean, it's important so that the web page can work in itself, that narratively it can work for itself. But if we are thinking that one button is going to allow us access to different teaching material, so that a teacher, or such as Francisco said, what activities can I do? How can I work with this and that? But we are thinking about a lot of the young people, for them to be the bridge that can allow us to share that knowledge within the web page. But that's something that we are going to build within the first month. These meetings help us a lot to understand the needs of the project, but we do believe in having teaching elements within the page so that they can be a very central and important part to understand the page. Thank you for your clarification. Eva, I don't know if you have something short. No, yeah, it's something super short. I think it has a lot to do with how these communication strategies need to be sustainable and how them can be scaled. I mean, we are going to invest time, knowledge, resources, so we also have to think about how we can enhance these strategies. And through my doctoral work, there was a risk communication program that was, proposed by the municipal government, actually. And the main strategy was to take this message to the most vulnerable communities and to their classrooms. All this, meetings, and along with learning materials, teaching materials that the teachers could use later on in their classroom. And it wasn't just that they explained it in the classroom, but they actually took the children to get to know the city. It was called a classroom city program. So it wasn't just teaching materials in the classroom, but actually how that learning material and that teaching material manifests itself in the territory. And that was the part that the children liked the most, because they don't know the entire city most of the times. They don't know the places that are most exposed or not. I mean, they can see kind of different hazards, but not all of them. So I think that was very important, and that was perhaps, I think Cassandra also mentioned how we can link these communication strategies with communication, kind of link it with the curriculums that are already in place. So I think that's a very good way in which we can see this through. Thank you, Eva. Karina? Kind of to summarize everything and just wrap it up, I think that when we are working on with such complex discourses like the ones Francisco mentioned, and when we have an audience that's very different from us, I think that a very important exercise is making an exercise of understanding the otherness. Who is this other, and kind of adopting within our research group people from that space. I mean, I've been working with people in the Amazon region, for instance, and with Amazon communities, and it is very hard that in a short time I can, me as an individual, can actually know enough from the other culture to actually be that bridge. It's a very short period of time, but what I can do is have these representatives with me that understand my language, and that they can take that message to their community. It was what Cassandra was talking about, so to create these bridges, with these young people. But it's this way of thinking, of understanding the other and recognizing their languages, so that they themselves can be managers of those messages. I mean, the idea is for them to self-inform and so that the information comes from themselves. You know, we have this very hierarchical idea of transmitting knowledge, and it's kind of just, you know, make flatten them, you know, and so that communicating is more effective. Thank you, Karina. I think this discussion has been very useful. So we're gonna have this exercise. We're a bit later. Who has to leave soon? Please raise your hand. Raise those little blue hands, because normally it goes up until 10:15. So let's try and continue nonstop today and have the exercise. Go, Karina.
Entonces les voy a compartir mi pantalla un momento. De todas formas, como ustedes saben, tienen
I'm just gonna share my screen with you. Well, you all have the link as well, and the instructions are there. We're going to divide ourselves in groups. Ellie is gonna help us doing the groups in Zoom. And the idea is that you're gonna find, you know, in this button here, that's Expo Kit, you're gonna find a folder, a drive folder. I'll share the link with you. Yeah, in the chat, there's a drive folder that has different materials, right? It has an audio, it has a couple of images, it has a short text, and it's linked with the research that, excuse me for opening things, you know, like this, but here it is, Expo Kit. That's the folder. You're gonna find a short text, a map, an audio, and a couple of archive photographs. It's part of the research from the historians that are part of this project. And the idea is that along with our groups that are, you know, each of you have a worksheet here. The idea is for us within our groups to try to plan an exposition, you know, independent from, regardless of where you consider to be most relevant, but aimed at different audiences, right? So, for example, in group 1, the audience is children between 10 and 15 years. Group 2, they have the exact same material, but for blind people. No, third group is precisely that, but for seniors, you know, between 60 and 80 years old. Each group has a different audience, but we're all going to work with the exact same material. And the idea of this exercise is to analyze within our group and to decide things about, like, what would be the best way, the best platform? Does it have to be physical, digital? Does it need to be a theater? It needs to be artistic? It needs to be technical? Depends on how you or what you feels best. And afterwards, we can discuss about the conclusions and the difficulties that this exercise, you know, creates. In the same files, you are going to have the instructions that I just said, both in Spanish and English. And if you have any questions, we're here as well. Quick questions. I think everyone here speaks Spanish, except for Giuseppe, that can understand very well. So I don't know if it's worth that Caesar can be here or he can leave. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, here's the link, but Cassandra says that the link in the platform is also working now, so no. Yeah, I'm
Hola chicos.
Hola, ¿cómo les va?
¿Qué tal? Hola.
Todo bien. ¿Qué grupo somos?
El 1. Dice.
El 1. Aguante.
Solo le voy a escribir a la Eli para decirle que sí, le digan César que puede irse un ratito.
A ver, grupo 1. Y está cargado aquí, ¿no es cierto? Espera.
Tú tienes el
Sí,
link.
grupo 1, sí. Ahorita ya estoy en el Google Docs. Nos tocan niños y niñas de 10 a 15 años. Ya. Y el material está abajo. Espera, el Expo Kit es, ¿no? Sí vieron el material. Ya.
Sí, vale. Yo tengo abierto, pero estoy en el Google Drive del documento nada más.
Ya, yo tengo ahorita el Expo Kit, que es los materiales, y bueno, yo les cuento un poco qué nomás tienen. Verás, hay un mapa de la erupción del Cotopaxi, la de 1877. Hay unas fotos de archivo que son varias que podemos usar, que es, bueno, las del terremoto de 1868, hay dos, y una palmera, que es la palmera que se llama la esquina del Coco en Ibarra, que es la esquina donde se reconstruyó toda la ciudad de Ibarra. Tiene solamente esa palmera que era desde donde midieron toda la reconstrucción. Y de ahí hay una carta de Juan Montalvo dirigida a Pedro Carbo sobre el terremoto de
Él les va a hablar de la reivindicación geopoética.
Exacto.
Bonito.
Válgame.
Dale, Pancho, te escuchamos.
Bueno, entonces compartí mi pantalla ya. Y bueno, la idea básicamente fue de reivindicar un poco lo que significa la geopoesía para los que somos geólogos. Normalmente la geopoesía es un término que nosotros utilizamos cuando un científico tiene muy pocos datos y con esos datos hace una sobreinterpretación de ellos y se inventa así toda una historia. Entonces, un poco es reivindicar esa palabra y utilizarla para explicar de una forma un poco más como hiperbólica, no sé, un poquito más exagerada, cómo suceden varios hechos. En este caso, tomando el mapa de Wolf y ciertas herramientas tecnológicas como esta que nos permiten ver en 3 dimensiones un poco el tránsito de los lajares en el Cotopaxi. La idea es utilizar la misma lectura que nos dieron, los 2 párrafos, me parece de Wolf, y mientras narran esos párrafos, ir mostrando las zonas que fueron afectadas. Yo recuerdo un pasaje de Wolf en donde mencionaba una parte súper dramática, que te llega mucho, que es que habían unas personas que iban en caballo, que estaban justo en el tránsito de los lajares y empezaron a cabalgar a toda velocidad tratando de huir de los lajares, pero lamentablemente fueron enterrados por ellos y arrastrados. Entonces, un poco más o menos esa es la idea de mezclar lo que se ve un poco en la ciencia física, es cómo fluyen los lajares, qué áreas recorren, pero también darle un poco de ese impacto en la sociedad, de cómo afecta el lajar, cómo es que puede ser tan destructivo, cómo puede ir mucho más rápido que un caballo. Esa ya es una cuantificación de las cosas, que es lo que nos gusta a los físicos, pero también mostrando que pueden matar, que son muy peligrosos, etc. Eso creo. No sé si quieren
Bien, los
aportar algo
geopoetas.
más. Sí, es la geopoesía, es hacernos un cuento completo, un poco mezclando las cosas cuantitativas y un poco las cosas más descriptivas.
Chévere,
Gracias.
súper,
¿Cuál
lindísimo.
era su público?
Académicos.
Ese
Ah,
fue
ok.
nuestro problema.
Ah, ok. Ese fue el problema.
Los más difíciles.
Claro.
Los difíciles.
Bueno, a
Sí,
ver,
las
¿quién más quiere?
politécnicas.
¿Y cuáles fueron sus dificultades? ¿Qué encontraron de difícil?
¿Cómo dirigirnos a ese público? Y pensamos en Marco, sin alusiones personales.
¿Cómo le hablarían a Marco?
Ok, ¿alguien más quiere hablar? ¿Algún otro grupo? El que estaba Cassandra, que ya también ya se tiene que ir.
Bueno, a nosotros nos tocó la audiencia de no videntes. Entonces, claro, era el mega reto porque la plataforma web, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, pensábamos obviamente se tenía que transformar en una experiencia sonora. Sin embargo, problematizábamos esa experiencia, ¿no? ¿Cómo tendría que ser? No solamente con esta voz automática del plugin que te va narrando o describiendo acciones, sino enriquecer con paisaje sonoro y que pensábamos que podría resultar bien interesante representar cómo Wolf hizo la investigación en el Cotopaxi. Él no se subió a un avión, no tenía un dron, él lo hizo caminando. Entonces pensábamos cómo hacer esta experiencia del ruido, del caminar, de tomar algo, de ir contando. Entonces pensábamos que hasta metodológicamente, o sea, cómo transmitir la metodología de investigación podría resultar efectivo a través de los sonidos, ¿no? Y siempre cruzar descripciones, por supuesto, para dar un contexto, tanto histórico como físico. Lo pensábamos para lo del coco, esta palma, o sea, así decir, bueno, una palma de tanto de alto, tanto grosor, o sea, una descripción física, pero que esté acompañado de testimonios, que son la que la enriquecen y le dotan de un simbolismo, ¿no? Entonces, si alguien más quiere contribuir, pero creo que a grandes rasgos iba por ahí la discusión.
¿Ya? ¿Alguien más de ese grupo que quiera decir algo? Pero bonito, ¿no? Me parece bonito también esa idea del caminar y cómo transmitir
Caminar,
eso.
sí.
A ver, otro grupo. ¿Quién más se anima?
Nosotros.
A ver, Mari.
El grupo 1. Bueno, nosotros escogimos el terremoto el evento como el terremoto de Ibarra de 1868. Usamos la carta, el texto que había de Juan Montalvo, y nuestra audiencia era un público de niños entre 10 a 15 años. Entonces pensamos más o menos en qué andan los niños en este tiempo, ¿no? Los niños y jóvenes. Y pensamos en un video en formato YouTube, porque es muy fácil y ahora todos andan metidos en ese tema de YouTube, pero lo pensamos desde enfocado en hacer un taller como para hacerles conocer y motivarles a hacer ese video a ellos mismos. Y aparte, pensar en el quichua, o sea, en un idioma bilingüe, quichua-español, con una influencia de los nin. No sé si han escuchado, es un rap quichua. Entonces, algo así como ese tipo de cosas, pero generando como una cultura de riesgo, porque muchos chicos, por ejemplo, de 10 a 15 años ni siquiera conocen que hubo el terremoto, por ejemplo, y que hay las fiestas del retorno porque hubo el terremoto, por ejemplo. Entonces pensamos que esa era una buena idea para un público de este estilo.
Qué chévere.
Sí, buena idea, ¿no? Y eso de además de incluir a las personas en hacer conjuntamente los materiales. ¿Alguien más? Marco, en tu grupo, ¿quién estaba ahí? Tú estabas con la Marisa.
No, estaba conmigo. Sí
Ya,
que,
a ver,
bueno,
Cari.
nosotros no elegimos representantes, pero a ver, yo voy diciendo y que mi grupo me complemente si es que me olvido algo. A nosotros nos tocaron adultos mayores, personas sobre los 60 años. El material, bueno, sacamos como conclusión principal de que el material que teníamos por la estética, por el tipo de lenguaje, más bien nos jugaba a favor, es decir, iba a ser más familiar para nuestra audiencia y quizás el problema era que tiene este tono un poco como de tragedia o que podía reforzar esta idea de que los desastres naturales simplemente ocurren y no hay nada que hacer y es terrible, que también es una cosa que generacionalmente también lo vemos. vimos un poco también que al ser personas mayores puede haber cierta resistencia en abrirse a tener nuevos conocimientos y nuevas cosas, especialmente de según quién. Entonces hay como ciertas resistencias que hay que tratar de sortear. Y por tanto decidimos que el tipo de discurso y la persona que tenga que dar ese mensaje tiene que tener un tono súper similar a ellos, es decir, súper de pares, que sean ellos mismos quienes hablan de esto. Y entonces hablamos un poco de recursos más testimoniales, de cosas de llevarlo hacia el recuerdo, o hacia sus propias experiencias o las experiencias de sus familiares. Entonces, a partir de eso también tratar de salir de esta lectura más determinista del material, que es como una cosa que además se genera un montón en este tipo de temas. Determinamos también que el lenguaje coloquial de algunas cosas, por ejemplo del audio, puede ayudarnos para aterrizar en estos espacios. Dentro de eso pensábamos, bueno, ¿qué formato tendría que tener eso? Entonces hablábamos de que quizás tendría que ser una cosa más experiencial y más oral, es decir, mesas redondas o videos testimoniales, un poco más presencial de ellos, aunque grupos focales, por ejemplo, o conversatorios. Y eso, ¿qué se me olvida? ¿Qué se me olvida,
No,
chicos?
está muy completo, Karina, en realidad.
Eso.
¿Y alguien que tenga una reflexión sobre la dificultad de hacer este ejercicio o qué cosas se le hicieron difícil? Bueno, entonces...
fácil, tú.
Chévere, les gustó. Entonces, bueno, para cerrar entonces este taller, agradecerles a todos por la participación y a Karina y a Jenny, aunque ya no está, por sus ponencias, también a Cassandra y a Paul por esa linda forma de ya mostrarnos las cosas que pueden hacer y cómo están pensando en los públicos. Y invitarles a la próxima sesión, que es la última de esta serie de grupos de discusión, donde vamos a hablar sobre la importancia de los testimonios y de los archivos. Así que, por favor, no se pierdan, es el último y luego tenemos vacaciones, así que con ánimo para el último. Y que venga el verano.
Muchas gracias, Eli.
Bien,
Ya.
muchas gracias a todos por estar y por participar.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Nos
Gracias y buen fin de semana.
Gracias.
Chao, chao. Gracias.
Gracias.